Welcome to American History 1607 to 1865, where we uncover the hidden truths of Native American history. My name is Memphis Cleveland, and today we're diving deeper into the story of the Ho-Chunk Winnebago delegation that traveled to Washington, D.C. in 1828. We'll also explore their resistance to becoming a federally recognized tribe due to this deceit and manipulation. And now, finally, where they stand today. It's important to note that during this time, they are both the same tribe. Now, they are two distinct, federally recognized tribal agencies who share an intimate history, culture, and heritage. In 1828, the Winnebago people, particularly those living in the northwest portion of their homelands, faced the imminent threat of losing their land. Because of this, there are many accounts of cabinet officials of the U.S. government that recall the series of events that unfolded during this time. For example, quoting from the Louise Phillips Kellogg article, The Winnebago Visit to Washington in 1828, they highlight the historical context of a so-called Winnebago War occurring in 1827. This war might have proved disastrous for the northwest frontier had not the rapid movement of wise councils that were sent to prevent the bloodshed on all frontiers. The cause of this war was the invasion of Winnebago lands between the Mississippi and Rock Rivers that was led by miners. Lead miners, to be exact. These people depleted and overran their territory, drove off the game that was needed to sustain the tribe, and made free with all the indigenous people that they considered their own. Yet the deepest, most vital cause was the hatred of the tribe for the Americans, whose occupation of the region had never become reconciled. For historical context, the Winnebago tribe predominantly lived in the Midwest, particularly in Wisconsin. During the wars with the French regime, the tribe had found themselves weakened in numbers, but not less proud, intractable, and aloof in spirit, says Kellogg. The Winnebago and the Ho-Chunk tribe were said to be the most active associates of Tecumseh and the Shawnee. Pride in their rebellion against the might of the United States, the tribe was known to fiercely resent the coming of American troops in 1816, and was reportedly said that they were only subdued by the fear of the cannon that was placed on their forts when Redbird, the chief of the tribe, surrendered in 1827 at the Portage. The Lieutenant Governor Cass and his General Atkinson had put down the growing rebellion. Governor Cass, in the summer of 1828, called to the Winnebago chiefs to a council in Green Bay, Wisconsin. Before the council was ready to meet, he wrote to the Commissioner of the Indian Affairs, recommending a plan that he held was more merciful than bayonets and canyons. Cass wrote that a party or delegation be permitted to visit our cities to impress them with our power. It may tend to quiet their restlessness and tame their ferocity. The commissioner favored this plan. Then the War Department approved and gave orders that 15 chiefs be invited to Washington, D.C., and that John H. Kinsey accompany them. Meanwhile, while all of this is coming into fruition, the beloved Chief Redbird had passed away at the prison in Prairie du Chien. Then, the governor had ordered a fort be built at the Portage, in the heart of the Winnebago land. During the council meeting, Governor Cass and Pierre Menard of Illinois had met the chiefs and invited them to pay a visit to their great father, the President of the United States. During this meeting, there was heavy discussions of who was going to go on this trip and the actual personnel of the delegation. Again, it's important to note the intricacies of the tribe. There were two principal families, in which consisted of the Decorah and the Caramani, both of which had rights to the now open head rights to become the new chief of the tribe. Eventually, it was decided that the Washington delegation would be led by the Caramani families of this time. The Caramani's village was the first on Green Lake of the Fox River, but conceding the visit to Washington and the soon-to-be Treaty of 1829, the Caramani were removed to the Baraboo River. The elite elder Caramani, known as Nakan, was now the principal chief of the nation. Coincidentally enough, he had also been Tecumseh's greatest advisor and was actually present at his death at the Battle of Thames. Now that we've laid the real ground about who was leading this Washington delegation, it really wasn't a singular chief at all, but families comprised of young men who could be afforded to leave the villages without much disruption back home. The Caramani's kinsmen Huaninga was the orator of the delegation. When Henry Clay visited the Winnebago in Washington, he indicated him as the one possessing the greatest talent. Konoka Decora, a descendant of the late chiefess of the family, Glory of the Morning, was sent in the delegation for his nobility, courteousness, and dignified demeanor. He was thought to be a great representation of the tribe. It was said on many different accounts that anyone that knew him would give him the highest of consideration. Because of the long journey and his age, it was speculated that this is actually why he ended up taking his son with him, Spoon Decora, a young, vibrant, and described as an inconspicuous member of the deputation, to help take care of him and aid him on this long journey. Another Decora was present in the delegation. He was a prominent figure and from the upper Mississippi near La Crosse, Wisconsin's villages. His name was Wakanhaga, or snakeskin. Remembered because he wore the skin of a rattlesnake, woven above his head as a turban. Oddly enough, he was known as Washington Decora after this fateful trip. People described him as handsome and large in stature, standing about 6 foot 3 inches tall, and a great spokesman for his tribe. Another member of the delegation was the nephew of an old chief whom the whites called Dandy, because of his fondness for dress. The only accounts I could find of this delegate member was that his name was Little Soldier on this trip, because he bore the hardships well. This family was a part of the village who guarded the entrance to Lake Winnebago and what is now known as Dottie's Island, but it used to be Hujopi. The Rock River Band was represented by Kare Kasa, White Crow, whose village resided on Lake Kashkanan. White Crow brought his young daughter, just 18 years old, and was reported to be absolutely beautiful. This was also the only woman brought on the delegation. Unimportant to the story, but when they returned, she ended up marrying another member of the party, Yellow Thunder. And she too was also known as Washington Woman by her people back home. Mrs. Kenzie described her as a pleasant acquaintance, remembered for her airy greetings. She remembers her actually saying, "You and I have seen the world." How cute is that? And the last prominent member of the delegation was Talk English, supposedly a remarkably handsome and powerful young Indian man. He received his name on this trip because of the reiteration of that exact expression. From what it sounds like, a lot of these people making this trip had a profound impact regarding not only their names, but their identity associated with this trip. This is really the end of what I could find on who the Winnebago delegation were in terms of identification. The rest of the delegation kind of went unreported and unnamed. So we just have to assume that these are the friends and close family members of the chiefs back home. Again, I'm going to reiterate that the reason that this faction of people that had the chance to go weren't the people that normally made the decisions for the tribes in various villages. We do know, however, that there were 6 other members of the deputation that were also accompanied by the conductors Robert Forsyth, Secretary Governor Cass, and John H. Kenzie, who was recently appointed the Indian agent at Fort Winnebago. Along with them was probably one of the most important people of this delegation. He was an interpreter by the name of Pierre Paquette. He was a half-breed Winnebago who had charge of transfers at the portage and was pretty much loved by both the tribe and the communities. And in some texts, it emphasizes that he was the only competent interpreter of the Winnebago language, as he spoke both French, English, and Ho-Chunk. The only caveat that I read about Mr. Pierre Paquette was that he could neither read nor write. Now, this is important information because the main line of communication is through a man that can't read contracts to accurately interpret for the rest of the delegation. This does have an impact on the true events that are about to unfold and what is to come of the tribe. Finally, let's jump into the actual trip of the deputation. Of the 15 men and 1 woman, along with the 3 conductors, they all left Green Bay after they had finished concluding the council negotiations. They arrived in Detroit about the 1st of September, where they remained in Detroit for a month, waiting for Governor Cass' convenience. And eventually, they left there on October 6th on the Niagara for Buffalo. When they got to Buffalo, they were then bused by stagecoach across New York State. All the while, Governor Cass traveled straight to Washington by a shorter route than the delegation took. Suspicious? I think so. The delegation ended up passing through Utica and Albany, and then took a river steamboat to New York City, where they eventually arrived on October 19th. The most interesting part of this trip were the text of the accounts that was happening. It was noted that during their promenades through different taverns and restaurants, these experiences were completely new to them. An account that actually piqued my interest and was quite comical to me was a tavern owner and his waitress. They highlighted these big Indian men dressed to the nines in clothes that they've never seen before. And they quite emphasized on the big nature and stature of these men, as well as maybe being a little intimidated. When they woke up for morning breakfast, the table was set. They all sat down and started to eat. Shortly after, it was noted that the stagecoach horn started to blow, signifying they had a very short time before they had to leave. Just then, they all stood up, sprung to their feet, and the waitress noted that one man seized the plate of all of the biscuits and poured them into the corner of his blanket. They also said that another took the remains of the pairs of chicken that were on the table and put them into their bag. The third guy just then emptied the sugar bowls, which laid hold of what was nearest to him, and ended up putting them in a can to take on his trip. In a trice, nothing was left on the table but empty placemats and dishes. The landlord and waiters ended up laughing about this and enjoyed the encounter. It's always interesting for me to be able to spread knowledge like this. Even back then, Ho-Chunks and Winnebagos haven't really changed too much in today's world. Because of the absolute buzz around these indigenous people in New York, they really took a tune to being enthralled with the people that were so different and diverse from them. There are stories about theaters offering them free tickets to shows and operas. And also, this was a ploy to get more people to come and to watch with the Indians. The museums that they had visited enjoyed their encounters. One quoted, "It was interesting to see how the Indians interacted with these inventions in these museums. They were amused at their lack of knowledge on how these things work. For example, they never really used such things as air pumps for tires and were completely enthralled by the invention." New York's enthusiastic adulation was definitely rebuked by the Washington journalists, who Indian visitors were less than a novelty. One man wrote, "Indians are intelligent men who should be treated so." On the last day of October, they finally arrived in Washington, D.C. They eventually domiciled at the Tennyson Hotel. Their whole stay in Washington lasted for 6 weeks, for which the hotel ended up charging them $1,700, including a $250 fee for damages done to the house. During this time, it was really prevalent that the Ho-Chunk wanted to entertain a lot of the citizens and show them a part of their culture. The Winnebago ended up staging a war dance on the common between the White House and the river, for which $1 admission was charged. Because it kept getting postponed again and again due to bad weather, it finally took place on the last of November. It sounded like this thing was a pretty big shindig. Because of how big it was getting, even the Marine Band played there, as well as different dances ended up adding to the original war dance. There was a discovery dance, a mock battle dance, and a rejoice dance. This really was one of the biggest celebrations that happened in Washington during this time. I just wanted to highlight this because I feel like it shows the personality and Ho-Chunk hospitality that was definitely portrayed in Washington for them. During and in between this time, there were amusements claiming the patronage of Washingtonians. The exhibition of Cruises trained animals, birds, and dogs entertained the Winnebago delegation more than once. Supposedly, a canary named Fairy was supposed to play dominoes, and one of the dogs was similarly accomplished. It was said that there was an extraordinary challenge when one of the members of the delegation challenged the animals to a contest. This, of course, created a buzz in Washington, D.C., and all of the newspapers were overzealous for this challenge. When I was actually looking for who won, it really wasn't reported. So let's rein ourselves back in here a little bit and remember the ultimate reason why this delegation is here in the first place. It was to have an interview with the president, or the great father, if you will. The now president was John Quincy Adams, and he received the Winnebago with a considerable amount of pomp and circumstance. To remind us why they were even in Washington in the first place, do you remember in the beginning of the story about the lead miners that really made it impossible for the Ho-Chunk in Winnebago to thrive? The actual visit was surrounded by the members of John Quincy Adams' cabinet and also certain invited diplomats. Nakan, the Carmani elder, started off by presenting the president with a peace pipe. It was pretty customary for the Winnebago people. Little Elk claimed an oration that was eventually translated by Paul Paquette, in which he assured that the Great Father, the president, that the tribe would maintain in perpetual peace. On December 2nd, the president received the delegation one more time and gave them a document to sign. Going into the meeting, they thought that they were going to have to cede portions of their land later on in return for the United States government's help on removing these trespassers of their lands. They also knew, because of the history against the United States government, that they were going to have to agree to a signature of peace, which they thought that they were doing. It was told to them and translated by Pierre, stating as follows: "This certified that she called Ji Shunkanga, Talk English, a Winnebago chief and company with 14 other chiefs and warriors of that nation, has visited the seat of government of the United States and held friendly councils and smoked the pipe of peace with me in my house, having full confidence of the declarations freely and solemnly made by him and his associates of their determination to maintain perpetual peace and friendship with the United States. I recommend him to the favorable notice and consideration of all my white and red children. Signed, John Quincy Adams, President of the United States." Then each member of the delegation signed off on this piece of paper, signing their names with X's because, again, none of them could read or write. Pierre translated for them that they were going to get a $20,000 stipend for their hardships. And I'll kind of circle back to when they knew that they were going to have to cede lands. It was explained to them and Pierre that they were given 8 years to decide which lands that they wanted to cede and how much of it that they could afford to give back. Happy with the deal that they struck with the United States government and all the fun that they had leading up to and talking during and after the meeting with the president, they were ready to finally head home. As Kenzie prepared for their return journey, the tribes had been fitted out with clothes by a fashionable tailor who made them 15 blue frock coats and as many pair of leggings to match, 16 blue cloth caps, and perhaps one for Paquette, cloth and ribbon for the women, and 36 pair of stockings, 12 pairs of shoes. By then, they finally ended up traveling across the country by stage, eventually landing themselves back in Detroit, Michigan by the last of the year. Horses, saddles, and bridles were there for them waiting. They then journeyed homeward to their separate Wisconsin villages with as many gifts, stories, and new relations to testify the great welcome that they have received. If we can just stop and kind of imagine what their emotions were like at this time, I can only think that they're riding on an emotional high as they come back from this beautifully extravagant trip with things that they can't even begin to explain to their kin. Also, adorned with gifts and clothes to help the tribe, as well as that $20,000 stipend. The visit of the chief delegation was justified by its results. The expense of the trip was the total of $10,000, $272.05 to be billed to the United States government. This expense would have been less than what a war have costed them against the great fighters of the Winnebago tribe. The Winnebago and Ho-Chunk tribe never again attempted to revolt against the government authority. And only 4 years later, when one of their greatest allies with the Sac and Fox went on the warpath with Black Hawk, the Winnebago were restrained from joining them because they believed their own chiefs had the might and the power of the United States behind them. Returning back home, especially friendly to the white people, were the chiefs of that delegation. Eventually helping the white people defeat Black Hawk, they brought him in as a prisoner to Prairie du Chien. Clearly, the United States felt that this trip to Washington was a great investment for the future welfare of Wisconsin. Let's circle back to that treaty. The delegation was presented really with a treaty. We now know that it completely misrepresented the terms. The title of this report was the Winnebago Indians' Letter from the Secretary of War, transmitting a report of Governor Cass and Colonel McKinney on the subjects of the complaints of the Winnebago Indians, February 5th, 1828. This referred to the committee of the whole House, to which is committed by the Bill number 103 to enable the President of the United States to hold a treaty with a Chippewa, Ottawa, Potawatomi, Winnebago, Fox, and Sac nations of Indians. This means that what the Winnebago signed on, they signed away land and treaty rights for all of these tribes. On page 3, docket number 117, the Department of War stated that he has the honor to transmit for the information of the Committee on Indian Affairs a report from Governor Cass, Colonel McKinney on the subjects of the complaints of the Winnebagos, which contains also a recommendation to procure by cession mineral country owned by them and by other tribes as a best remedy to quiet their excitements. Reading through the treaty, they're able to write down the Winnebago delegation's complaints of people invading their territories, and Colonel McKinney does ask for the pension. For that, it's also noted that they bring to the attention the valuableness of not only the Winnebago tribe's lands, but other tribes as well. In fact, the colonel quotes, "The country, however, is more valuable to us than to them. It is, in fact, the most important region affording an inexhaustible supply of lead. We think it highly unnecessary that the Indians claim title to it, and it should be extinguished, and we anticipate little difficulty in effecting that object in appropriation of a payment of $20,000. That would probably enable the government to procure a district embracing the mineral region and which should yield a productive revenue to the public and profitable returns to enterprising individuals. Yours respectfully, your obedient service, Lewis and Thos L. McKinney." Signed by the Honorable James Barber, Secretary of War. Reading this, you almost can't comprehend the utter vile and despicable ways the United States government takes advantage of naive tribes. When Paquette was translating, of course, he could not read what was actually being written, and to him he translated that the tribe was going to be getting money to help from the government and for keeping people off of their land to buy extra time before they eventually would cede some of their properties. They did believe they had those 8 years before they would have to move, but in turn, the treaty stated 8 months. We now know today that this deceit wasn't just to the Ho-Chunk and Winnebago, but happened far more than we can count. Despite resistance and attempts to renegotiate, the treaty was forced upon them. There was, however, a faction of the people that resisted the treaty and hid out. The deception and manipulation experienced by the Ho-Chunk and Winnebago people during treaty negotiations had a lasting impact. In later years, when the federal government sought to recognize the tribes, the Ho-Chunk were very wary. They remembered this betrayal in 1828 and were reluctant to trust the government ever again. This resistance to federal recognition stemmed from a deep-seated distrust born out of historical deceit. During the negotiations, President John Quincy Adams entertained the delegation with lavish parties. He provided them with alcohol and other forms of entertainment, hoping to sway their opinions and really weaken their resolve. These manipulation tactics were used to cloud their judgment and to force them into compliance. Despite these challenges and all the hardships that the Ho-Chunk and Winnebago people have endured, these people have persevered. Today, they maintain their cultural identity, traditions, and continue to fight for their rights and sovereignty. While they have faced many hardships throughout this history, their spirit remains unbroken. Today, the Ho-Chunk Nation and the Winnebago tribe of Nebraska are both federally recognized tribes with reservations and trust lands in Nebraska stemming all the way over to Wisconsin. Despite the challenges, they both remain resilient and extremely proud of their heritage. This really concludes the end of the story for this delegation. Although they all went there with really great intentions, unfortunately, the United States government made an active decision to deceive, take from, and neglect the needs of the tribes. What are your opinions on the relationship between the United States and tribal agencies today? Do you think that they're any better than they were then? What do you think that they can do better? Please like, comment, and subscribe to this podcast and join us next time as we uncover more stories from the past and present of Native American tribes. I'm Memphis Cleveland, and I thank you for listening to American History 1605 to 1865. See ya.